David lived in a small neighborhood where all the houses looked alike. Every street had the same trimmed bushes, the same neat lawns, and the same fences painted white. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other while collecting mail, but also the kind of place where every detail was watched. The Homeowners Association, known by everyone as the HOA, was the invisible power that shaped how the neighborhood looked. They sent letters if the grass was too long. They fined people if paint on the fence chipped, and they even argued about the height of garden plants. David was not someone who liked rules for the sake of rules. He had moved into this neighborhood because he wanted peace and safety, not because he loved strict control. He worked at a local workshop in town and spent most evenings in his garden. Gardening gave him joy. He planted vegetables, flowers, and even grew herbs that he used in his cooking. But what he loved most was the idea of living in balance with nature. That was why he set up a rainwater collection system in his backyard. It was simple. When rain fell on his roof, it flowed into pipes that directed it to a set of barrels he placed near the corner of the yard. The barrels filled quickly during the rainy season, and he used that water for his garden during the dry weeks. It helped him save money, but more than that, it made him feel like he was doing something right. Instead of letting clean rainwater flow into the street drains and disappear, he stored it to keep his plants alive. One warm afternoon, David returned home from work to find an envelope stuck tightly in his mailbox. It looked official, with the bold letters of the HOA on top. He opened it casually, not expecting much. But as he read the words, his smile faded. The letter stated that he had violated community rules by hoarding rainwater. It claimed that the barrels were against neighborhood standards and that he had 7 days to remove them. If he refused, he would be fined $100 for every week the barrels remained. David stared at the paper in disbelief. He read it again, hoping he misunderstood. Hoarding rainwater? The very idea sounded strange. Rain fell from the sky, free for all. How could anyone own it? He thought about all the water rushing down streets every time it rained, wasted and forgotten. Yet here he was, punished for saving some of it. At first he laughed. It seemed like a silly mistake. Maybe the letter was sent to him by accident. Maybe someone in the office clicked the wrong box. But as he looked closer, he saw pictures attached to the notice. Someone had taken photos of his yard from behind the fence. The barrels were circled in red ink as if they were dangerous objects. His laughter faded, replaced by a heavy feeling in his chest. This was no mistake. Someone had complained and the HOA had listened. He sat down at his kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of him. His mind spun with questions. Why would anyone care about a few barrels of water? Who had taken the pictures? And why did the HOA think they had the right to tell him what to do with rain that fell on his own roof? That evening, David went out into his yard. The barrels stood quietly in their place, half filled from the last storm. He touched the wooden lids, feeling the cool dampness inside. He thought of how many times this water had helped his plants survive the dry days. His tomatoes, his roses, his small apple tree, all of them grew healthier because of this simple system. He thought about tearing the barrels down to avoid trouble. It would be easy to drain them, roll them away, and pretend they never existed. But as he looked at his garden, another thought came. If he gave in now, what would stop the HOA from demanding more? Today it was barrels. Tomorrow it could be his vegetable patch, or the color of his garden chairs, or the small wind chime that hung by his porch. The more he thought about it, the stronger he felt. He had not broken any law of the town or the state. Collecting rainwater was legal. The HOA was making up rules for its own power, and if he gave in, he would be saying that their power mattered more than his own rights in his own home. As the sun set, he made his decision. He would not remove the barrels. The next morning, David walked to his mailbox again. This time he felt the eyes of his neighbors on him. Some smiled weakly, others looked away. He realized then that the neighborhood was full of silent watchers. Some might support him quietly, but none would dare speak up. The HOA had that effect. People feared being targeted, so they stayed quiet. David, however, could not stay quiet. He wrote a letter back to the HOA. His words were firm but respectful. He explained that the rain fell freely on his roof, and that he used it responsibly for his garden. He explained that no law was broken and that he would not remove the barrels. He sent the letter and waited. A week passed, then another. The air grew heavy with summer heat. No rain came, and his barrels began to run low. Still, the plants in his garden stayed alive thanks to what he had saved earlier. Each time he watered them, he felt a sense of pride. He was doing what made sense, not what was demanded. But then another letter arrived. This one was sharper. It said his refusal to comply was unacceptable. The fine had been applied. $100. If the barrels were not removed within 3 days, the fine would double. David folded the letter slowly. His heart beat faster, not with fear, but with anger. He was not a man who liked conflict, but he could not ignore the unfairness anymore. He thought about all the hours he worked at the workshop, the sweat, the effort, the careful saving of money. And now some board, some group of neighbors who wanted everything neat and controlled, was demanding his hard-earned money because he collected rainwater. That night, he barely slept. He lay awake, listening to the crickets outside and the distant hum of cars on the highway. His mind was restless. He thought about the barrels, the letters, the neighbors who avoided his eyes. He thought about the meeting he knew he had to attend soon, where the board would sit behind their long table and speak to him as if he were a child breaking rules. As dawn broke, David rose with a clear plan. He would not surrender. He would go to the meeting. He would stand before them and speak. He would tell them that what they were doing was wrong, not just for him, but for everyone. Because if rain itself could be fined, then freedom in the neighborhood was nothing but an illusion. David stepped outside that morning, the letter still folded in his pocket. He looked at his barrels, silent and steady in the corner of the yard. They were not just containers of water anymore. They were a symbol of his right to live sensibly, his right to care for his garden, his right to stand against rules that had no reason. The warning had come. But David was ready. The notice about the fine still sat on David's kitchen table, its bold letters glaring at him every time he walked by. He had read it so many times that the words were burned into his mind. The homeowners association was demanding payment, and they were threatening to increase the fine unless he obeyed. But David had already made his choice. He would not give in. He knew the next HOA meeting was only a few days away. Once a month, the board gathered in the community hall to discuss problems and enforce rules. Residents were allowed to attend, though most rarely did. The meetings had a reputation for being long, dull, and full of arguments about fence paint and grass height. But this time, David knew it would be different. His case was on the agenda. The night before the meeting, David sat in his living room thinking carefully about what he would say. He wanted to be clear and calm. He wanted to stand up for himself without losing his temper. He even wrote down a few points on a piece of paper. He listed how the rainwater was harmless, how it helped the garden, and how no law forbade it. He reminded himself that he was not breaking the law. The HOA rules were not the same as state laws. Still, he felt a heavy weight in his chest. He had seen how the board treated others. Neighbors whispered stories about being scolded for planting flowers too close to the sidewalk, about being fined for leaving a garbage bin out too long, about being threatened with legal action over tiny things. Most people simply gave up and obeyed. David wondered how many of them felt the same frustration but were too afraid to fight. When the day of the meeting came, David put on a clean shirt and walked toward the community hall. The building was small, a simple room near the playground. Bright lights glowed inside, and he could already hear the murmur of voices. As he stepped in, he saw rows of folding chairs arranged in neat lines facing a long table at the front. Behind the table sat the board members. Robert, the president of the HOA, sat in the center. He was a tall man with gray hair combed carefully back. His expression was always serious, almost cold. Beside him sat Linda, the secretary, who wrote down everything in her notebook. On the other side sat Paul, the treasurer, who always seemed eager to enforce fines. There were 2 other members as well, but they stayed mostly quiet. David walked slowly to an empty chair in the front row. He felt the eyes of the room turn toward him. Some neighbors gave him small nods of support, while others looked away as if they did not want to be seen taking sides. The air was tense, and David could sense that many people were curious to hear what would happen. Robert tapped his gavel on the table, calling the room to order. "We will now begin our monthly meeting," he said in a firm voice. "First, we will review reports, and then we will address specific violations. One of these violations concerns a resident who has chosen to disregard our rules about water storage." Everyone knew who he meant. A low whisper spread across the room. David sat up straighter, his jaw tight. After several minutes of reports and minor discussions about trash schedules and parking complaints, Robert finally turned to him. "David," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the room, "you have been fined for the violation of storing rainwater in barrels. This is against the rules of the association, and you have failed to comply with our requests. Would you like to explain your actions?" David rose slowly from his chair. His heart beat fast, but his voice was steady. "Yes," he said. "I would like to explain." The room grew quiet. Every neighbor leaned in, waiting to hear his words. "I collect rainwater from my roof," David began. "I do it using barrels in my backyard. The water is used for my garden. It does not harm anyone. It does not create any danger. It helps keep my plants alive when the weather is dry. I am not breaking any state law by doing this. What I am doing is legal. The only reason I am standing here is because of the HOA's rule, which I believe is unfair and unreasonable." He paused, looking around the room. Some neighbors nodded quietly. Others kept their faces blank. "I pay my dues," David continued. "I keep my yard clean. I respect my neighbors. But I cannot accept being fined for using rain that falls freely from the sky. If water that touches my roof is not mine to use, then what is? You cannot control the clouds. You cannot own the rain." For a moment, silence filled the room. David's words hung in the air, sharp and honest. Robert leaned forward, his eyes narrow. "Our rules exist for order, David," he said firmly. "If we allow you to collect water, then everyone will want to do it. Soon, barrels will be everywhere. They will be unsightly, they will attract pests, and they will ruin the image of the neighborhood. This is not about the law of the state. This is about our standards. If you live here, you must follow them." David felt anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. "Order should not mean control without reason. My barrels are neat, safe, and hidden behind my fence. They do not attract pests. They do not cause harm. You speak of image, but image cannot be more important than sense. We live in a time when water should not be wasted. Collecting rain is a way to respect nature. Why punish it?" Paul, the treasurer, spoke next. "Because rules are rules," he said quickly. "If we make an exception for you, then we lose authority. People will think they can ignore us. That cannot happen." David turned to him. "Authority should serve people, not control them. If a rule is unreasonable, it should be changed. You fear losing authority, but what about fairness? What about reason? Shouldn't that matter more than control?" The room stirred again. A few neighbors clapped softly before stopping under Robert's glare. David noticed their hesitation. They agreed with him, but they were afraid. Linda, the secretary, cleared her throat. "We understand your passion, David," she said gently. "But the rules were voted on years ago. They have been part of the guidelines since the neighborhood was built. Changing them would take a formal proposal and a majority vote. Until then, the rules must be followed." David nodded slowly. "Then maybe it is time for that change," he said. His voice grew stronger. "If the rules no longer serve the people, then the people must stand up and demand better ones. I will not pay a fine for something that is right. And I will not take down the barrels. If you want to take this further, then we will see where it leads. But I will not give up." A murmur swept the room. The courage in David's words struck something in his neighbors. For the first time, people were speaking softly to one another instead of staying silent. Robert slammed his gavel down. "That is enough," he said sharply. "You are in violation. The fine stands. If you refuse to pay, more fines will follow. If you refuse again, we will pursue legal action. This meeting is not a debate. It is a reminder of order." David sat down slowly. His hands were tight fists, but his face showed calm. He had said what he needed to say. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, some filled with respect, others with fear. He knew he had planted a seed, even if it had not grown yet. The meeting went on, but David barely heard the rest. His mind was full of thoughts. He had faced the board, and though they had refused to listen, he had spoken his truth. He had shown his neighbors that resistance was possible. When the meeting ended, people left the hall in groups. A few walked up to David quietly. One man whispered, "I agree with you. Keep fighting." A woman touched his arm and said softly, "You're right. We're with you, but we're afraid to speak." David smiled faintly at them. "Courage grows," he said. "One day it will be enough." As he walked home under the dim streetlights, he felt tired but strong. The board had power, but he had something they did not, the truth and the will to stand firm. The fight was only beginning. That night, as he lay in bed, he listened to the silence outside. He thought about the barrels standing steady in his yard. They had become more than water containers. They were now symbols of resistance. The board wanted to control him with fear, but fear would not win. David closed his eyes with a steady heart. The meeting had shown him the road ahead. He knew it would not be easy, but he also knew he would not walk it alone forever. Change begins with one voice, and he had made his heard. The battle with the HOA had only just begun. The days after the meeting moved slowly for David. The summer heat pressed heavily on the neighborhood, and the air grew still and dry. The grass on many lawns turned yellow, flowers bent under the weight of the sun, and small cracks appeared in the soil along the sidewalks. Even in such dryness, the HOA sent out their usual reminders about keeping lawns green and neat. Many neighbors shook their heads quietly, knowing it was impossible without spending large amounts of water. David's garden, however, still showed signs of life. His barrels were not as full as before, but the water he had saved kept his plants alive. He used it sparingly, carrying small buckets to pour at the roots of his tomatoes, cucumbers, and roses. His apple tree, though still young, stood proudly with leaves brighter than the dried hedges around the block. When neighbors walked past his house, some paused to admire it, though most said nothing aloud. They admired in silence, afraid of the rules that hung over them like an invisible cloud. Even so, the letters from the HOA kept coming. Each one repeated the same message: remove the barrels, pay the fine. More threats followed, and each fine was added to the next as if they believed that enough pressure would finally make him give up. But David held firm. Every time he opened his mailbox, he felt the anger rise, but he also felt strength. The more they tried to bend him, the straighter he stood. One evening, as he sat on his porch, he noticed the sky changing. The horizon darkened in the distance, and heavy clouds rolled in slowly like a gray army. The air cooled, and the smell of rain filled the breeze. The dry earth seemed to sigh with relief. David leaned against the railing, watching the sky with quiet anticipation. He had seen storms like this before, but this one felt different. Perhaps it was because of the tension building inside him, or perhaps it was because the land itself seemed ready for change. By nightfall, the first drops fell. They tapped against his roof, gentle at first, then stronger until the steady sound of rainfall filled the air. The barrels at the corner of his yard began to echo with the splashes of water flowing down from the pipes. David stepped out into the rain, letting it soak his shirt and cool his skin. He lifted his face toward the clouds and closed his eyes. The storm had come at last. The rain grew heavier as the hours passed. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and flashes of lightning lit up the sky. The barrels filled quickly, each one rising higher with every passing minute. David checked the lids, making sure they were secure, then added another connection pipe to direct the overflow into a larger container he had set aside. He worked with determination, feeling not only the power of the storm but also the power of his own resolve. By midnight, the storm reached its full force. Sheets of rain poured down, flooding the gutters and rushing through the streets. Small streams formed along the edges of driveways, and water swirled around drains that struggled to keep up. David stood in his yard, boots sinking into the soft soil, as he watched his barrels swell to the brim. One by one, they reached their full capacity. The water he had been fined for saving was now more than he could even contain. He thought of the HOA, sitting in their dry houses, planning more fines, more threats. He thought of Robert with his stern face, Paul with his eagerness to control, Linda with her soft voice that always returned to the safety of rules. They wanted him to empty his barrels, but now they were full, overflowing, unstoppable. A thought stirred in David's mind, a thought that had been growing since the meeting. If they believed water was a threat, then perhaps they needed to see what water could truly do. As the storm raged on, David walked to the back of his yard. There, at the lowest edge of his property, an old stream bed lay hidden beneath weeds and soil. Long ago, water had flowed there after every heavy rain, winding its way behind the rows of houses and out toward the woods. But over the years, the stream had dried as new streets and drains redirected the flow. The channel remained like a scar on the land, dry and forgotten. David had studied it many times, wondering if it could be restored. He had even built a small wooden gate near his fence, designed to release water from his barrels into that path. Until now, he had never used it. But tonight, As the storm filled his barrels to bursting, he felt the decision settle deep in his chest. The HOA had accused him of hoarding water. They said he could not keep it. Very well, he thought. Then he would let it go. The rain fell harder, beating against the roof like drums. David pulled on his gloves, tightened the straps on the barrels, and connected the pipes to the wooden gate. With one firm motion, he opened the latch. A rush of water poured out, strong and swift, surging down into the forgotten channel. At first it was a trickle, but soon it grew into a steady stream. The old bed seemed awake, carrying the water forward, weaving its way behind the houses just as it had in the past. The sound was powerful, like the return of something ancient. David followed the flow for a short distance, watching as it carved a shining path through the darkness. He felt a thrill in his chest. This was not destruction, it was restoration. Nature had returned, even if only for a moment. The neighbors noticed as well. Lights flicked on in windows. Curtains were pulled aside. Children pressed their faces against glass, pointing with wide eyes. Some people stepped out onto porches, their voices full of surprise. "The stream," someone whispered. "It's back." David heard the wonder in their voices. He stood taller, rain dripping from his hair as the storm continued to feed the flow. He thought about how much beauty had been lost under the weight of rules, and how a simple act of letting water run had reminded everyone of what was natural. But not everyone saw it that way. Before long, Robert appeared, marching across the wet grass with an umbrella in hand. His shoes splashed in the puddles, his coat flapped in the wind, and his face was red with anger. He shouted over the storm, his voice sharp and accusing. "What do you think you're doing, David? You're flooding the neighborhood. You're breaking every rule in the book." David turned to face him, calm and steady. "I'm not flooding anything. I'm releasing the water into the stream where it belongs. It's not mine anymore. It's nature's. You fined me for keeping it, so I've let it go." Robert's eyes widened with fury. "You're reckless. You're endangering property. This will not be tolerated." But David shook his head. "No harm has come. Look around you. The water flows as it once did. It harms no one. The only thing you fear is losing control. But you cannot control the rain." Several neighbors had gathered now, standing under umbrellas or simply letting the rain soak their clothes. Some nodded at David's words. Others murmured in agreement. For once, the silence of the neighborhood began to break. Robert glared at the crowd, then back at David. But the storm drowned out his authority. The thunder rolled, the stream rushed, and the people watched with something close to awe. Robert turned sharply and stormed away, leaving his words unfinished. David remained by the flowing water until the storm began to ease. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the stream, though smaller now, continued to carry water down its path. He felt both exhausted and alive. The HOA could send more letters, they could threaten more fines, but nothing they did could stop the rain, and nothing they did could erase what the neighbors had seen with their own eyes. That night, as David lay in bed, the sound of the running stream echoed faintly through the open window. It was a song of freedom, of defiance, of nature reclaiming its place. He smiled to himself, knowing that the storm had given him more than water. It had given him a victory. The battle was far from over, but now the tide had turned. The morning after the storm was quiet, but the ground still held the memory of the rain. Puddles glistened on the streets. The soil was soft beneath every step, and the air smelled fresh, washed clean of dust. Birds sang in the trees as if celebrating the storm that had broken the long dry spell. David woke early and stepped outside to see what had happened during the night. His barrels stood nearly empty now, their water released into the old stream. The channel behind the houses was still damp, carrying a thin ribbon of water that glimmered in the pale light. It was not the roaring stream of last night, but it was alive, and that alone made David's chest swell with pride. As he walked along his fence, he noticed neighbors out on their porches. They stood in pairs, talking and pointing toward the stream bed. Some smiled when they saw him, though most quickly turned away, careful not to show too much. David understood their fear. The HOA was still watching, and few wanted to be seen taking sides. By mid-morning, word had spread across the neighborhood. The stream had flowed again, and everyone knew why. Children talked excitedly about it, saying they had never seen water rushing behind the houses before. Some of the older residents remembered when the stream was natural, before construction redirected it. They spoke with nostalgia, recalling how they once played near its banks. But not everyone spoke kindly. Robert, the president of the HOA, had already begun calling it reckless. He went door to door, warning residents that David's actions had nearly caused a flood. He said the water could have damaged property, that it was a danger and that strict measures must be taken. His voice carried authority, but David noticed a difference this time. People listened politely, but their eyes drifted away. They were no longer nodding as quickly. They had seen the water with their own eyes, and it had not brought the disaster Robert claimed. That afternoon, David was in his garden, trimming branches from the apple tree, when he heard footsteps. Turning, he saw two neighbors approach. It was Anna, who lived 3 houses down, and her teenage son. They looked nervous, glancing around as if afraid of being seen. "David," Anna said softly, "I just wanted to tell you, what you did last night, it was brave. My son couldn't stop talking about the stream. He said it was the most exciting thing he had ever seen here." "Thank you for that," David smiled warmly. "I only opened the gate. Nature did the rest." Her son's eyes lit up. "It was amazing. The water was so strong. It felt like the land was alive again." Anna placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "We're not the only ones who feel this way. Others think you're right too, but they're afraid. The HOA has scared people for too long." David nodded. "Fear only has power if we stay silent. The more we speak, the weaker their grip becomes." Anna hesitated, then leaned closer. "Be careful, David. Robert is angry. He won't let this go. He's already talking about legal steps. I don't want to see you crushed by them." David's eyes were steady. "They may have power on paper, but they cannot fight the truth. Rain belongs to everyone. They cannot own the sky." Anna gave a small smile before leaving. Her son waved enthusiastically as they walked away. As the day went on, more neighbors came quietly to speak with David. Some offered small words of encouragement. Others brought stories of their own struggles with the HOA. One man admitted he had been fined for planting sunflowers too tall. Another whispered about being forced to repaint his fence 3 times because the shade of white was not officially approved. Each story added weight to the truth. David already knew. The HOA ruled through fear, not fairness. By evening, David sat on his porch, reflecting on the growing tension. He could feel the balance shifting. The storm had not only filled his barrels, but had also filled his neighbors with a memory of something freer, something beyond the strict grip of the board. The next day, the HOA called an emergency inspection. Robert and 2 other board members walked from house to house, writing notes on clipboards. When they reached David's property, Robert's face hardened. "David," he said sharply, "what you did last night was reckless. You cannot release water like that. It is a violation of safety and order." David stood calmly. "I did nothing unsafe. The stream carried the water naturally. It caused no harm." Robert jabbed his pen at the barrels. "These must go. You are out of chances. Either remove them or face serious consequences." David crossed his arms. "You fined me for keeping water. So I released it. What more do you want? The rain is not yours to control." Robert's voice rose. "This is not about the rain. This is about rules. Without rules, there is chaos." David's eyes met his. "There is a difference between rules and chains. I will not live in chains." The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Robert snapped his clipboard shut. "You'll regret this," he spat before marching away. That night, David sat alone, thinking deeply. The HOA was not going to stop. They would keep sending letters, keep threatening, keep tightening their grip. But the stream had shown him something important. The neighborhood was not united under the HOA's authority anymore. Cracks were forming. People were beginning to question. And he had lit that spark. Another storm arrived 2 days later. It was not as strong as the first, but it was enough to fill his barrels again. David stood at the wooden gate, hands resting on the latch. He thought about Robert's threats, about Anna's worried words, about the children's laughter when they saw the stream. He thought about freedom. With steady hands, he opened the gate once more. Water poured into the channel, flowing quickly down its path. This time, more neighbors came out to watch. Some cheered quietly, others stood in awe, and a few even clapped. The stream had become a symbol. It was not only about water, it was about defiance. Robert arrived again, shouting, pointing, threatening, but his words fell flat against the sound of rushing water and the growing confidence of the people. Someone from the crowd finally spoke up. "He's right, Robert. The water harms no one. Why are you fighting him?" Another voice joined. We're tired of these rules." More voices followed, each one breaking the silence that had held the neighborhood for so long. Robert's face turned pale with fury, but he could do nothing. The crowd was no longer silent. They were no longer afraid. David watched it unfold with quiet strength. He had not planned to lead anyone, but here they were, finding their voices because he had refused to bow. The floodgates had opened, not only in his garden but in the hearts of his neighbors. As the stream carried water into the distance, David felt a deep calm. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning. For the first time, he was not alone. That night, under the soft sound of water flowing faintly in the distance, David sat in his chair and let the weight lift from his shoulders. Nature had shown its power, and the people had begun to remember theirs. The floodgates were open, and nothing could close them again. The days after the second release of the water carried a quiet electricity in the air. The stream was no longer just a stream. It was a reminder, a symbol, something that made people whisper late at night or talk in low voices while walking their dogs. Everyone in the neighborhood felt the shift, even if they pretended not to. David kept working in his garden as usual, pruning trees, checking the barrels, repairing the wooden gate. Outwardly, he looked calm, but he could sense the storm gathering beyond the clouds. Robert had gone quiet. That silence worried David more than the shouting. A man like Robert did not accept defeat. He was planning something. The truth came one afternoon when a letter arrived in David's mailbox. Unlike the earlier notes, this one was thick, official-looking, and stamped with legal markings. David opened it slowly, reading the words with care. It was a formal notice. The HOA was suing him. They claimed he had violated safety codes, disrupted property values, and endangered the community with his reckless actions. David sat down at his kitchen table with the letter spread before him. He read it again and again. The words felt heavy, like chains tightening around his wrists. The HOA was no longer playing games with fines or warnings. They wanted to break him completely. Later that evening, Anna came by with her son. She saw the paper on the table and her face grew pale. "Oh no," she whispered, "I was afraid of this. They're trying to scare you into stopping." David gave a weary smile. "They are trying to scare me, yes. But fear only works if I surrender." Her son clenched his fists. "It isn't fair. You didn't do anything wrong." David looked at him with steady eyes. "Sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone, even when others call it wrong. But maybe I am not as alone as I once thought." The boy's eyes shone with hope, and Anna nodded slowly. "You're not alone anymore. People are talking, David. They are tired. They're waiting for someone to stand up for them." Word spread quickly about the lawsuit. At first, neighbors reacted with silence, but little by little something changed. A group of residents began to visit David, some bringing food, others offering small donations to help with legal costs. One man, Mr. Harris, an older gentleman who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built, said firmly, "I've had enough of this board. They've ruled with fear for too long. If they want to drag you into court, then they drag all of us too." David felt his chest tighten with gratitude. These people had once looked away when Robert pointed fingers, but now their voices were rising, trembling at first but gaining strength. The day of the first court meeting arrived. David walked into the small hearing room with a folder of papers tucked under his arm. To his surprise, more than a dozen neighbors came too. They filled the seats behind him, their presence a silent statement. Robert sat at the opposite table, flanked by lawyers in sharp suits. He glanced at the crowd with narrowed eyes, clearly unsettled. His plan had been to isolate David, to crush him alone. But the sight of the neighbors was proof that his grip was loosening. When it was David's turn to speak, he stood tall. His words were simple, without polished speeches or legal jargon. "I collected rainwater because I believe it belongs to all of us. I opened the gate because nature has a path, and it should not be silenced. I did no harm. The stream caused no damage. The only harm here is the constant fear this board uses to control everyone. That is not community, that is control." The room was quiet when he finished. For a moment, even the lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Robert's face turned red as he whispered furiously to them. But the words did not carry the same weight as before. The judge did not give a final decision that day, but he did say something that echoed through the room. "The question here is not simply about water. It is about the balance of rules and freedom. That balance must be considered carefully. When the hearing ended, neighbors clapped David on the back, whispering encouragement. Robert stormed out with his lawyers, his anger clear for all to see. In the weeks that followed, the HOA continued to push, but the neighborhood pushed back harder. Meetings that once felt like lectures turned into debates. Residents began questioning every rule, every fine, every demand. The board found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to maintain control. One evening, a community meeting was held in the park. Dozens of people gathered, more than David had ever seen attend before. Robert stood on the stage, trying to speak over the crowd, but his words were drowned out by questions. Why were flower beds banned? Why were children told they could not play in their own yards? Why was a man fined for painting his door blue? Finally, someone shouted from the back, "We want David to speak." The crowd turned, urging him forward. David hesitated, but then he walked slowly to the stage. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors. They were tired, but they were awake now. "I am no leader," David began, "but I believe in something simple. A neighborhood should be built on trust, not fear. We should be free to live with nature, not fight against it. The rain does not belong to me, and it does not belong to the board. It belongs to all of us. If we can see that, then maybe we can remember what it means to be a true community." The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time, Robert had no control. His voice was drowned, his power slipping away. In the weeks that followed, petitions circulated. Residents signed to remove the current board and elect a new one. When the vote finally came, the result was clear. Robert and his allies were voted out. A new council was formed, made of ordinary neighbors, including Anna and Mr. Harris. Their first decision was to end unnecessary fines and to allow residents more freedom over their homes and gardens. The lawsuit against David was dropped. His barrels remained where they stood, and the stream was left open for future rains. The neighborhood changed, slowly but surely. Children laughed as they played near the flowing water. Families planted gardens with pride. People greeted each other without fear of rules lurking in the background. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, David sat on his porch watching the golden light dance across the barrels. Anna joined him, carrying 2 cups of tea. She handed one to him and smiled. "You started something, David. Do you realize that?" David shook his head softly. "I didn't start it. Nature did. All I did was listen." She nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe. But listening is sometimes the bravest thing a person can do." The sound of the stream reached their ears, faint but steady. It was not loud, but it was constant, a reminder of the power that had broken the silence. As night settled, David felt a calm peace he had not known in years. The lesson was clear, and it was not only his to keep. The rain had taught them all that true freedom does not come from fighting nature, but from living with it. And true strength does not come from rules written in fear, but from voices joined together in courage. The floodgates had opened, and nothing could close them again.